Eric Duhatschek from The Athletic. Hi.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good too. It's Friday afternoon. I'm always good on Friday.
Are you okay with an audience?
Absolutely.
Anthony wants to stay and watch.
Absolutely.
Yes. Remember last week when we were talking about the music show?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he was one of them.
Okay. All right. Well, we can talk about music, but let's talk about hockey because there's a lot of hockey to talk about.
Dealer's choice. Where do you want to start?
Well, I'm good.
Because because just the way this works, we've missed. Let's start with Craig Conroy and being named the general manager.
Well, I know because you read my column that I fully and heartily endorsed it when it was clear that there was going to be an opening. Well, first of all, I mean, I think he should have been a general manager of the National Hockey League long before this. I think that he had paid his dues. He had only had the single interview with the Buffalo Sabres. It was perplexing to me that people that do what I do, whenever there was an opening and would list this bright young voice and that bright young face and so on and so forth of people that teams might hire, that Craig Conroy's name very rarely appeared on those lists. And I think it's, because lots of people in the industry are always looking for the new shiny toy, and you tend to overlook the people that do things the old fashioned way, which is you retire as a player and then you learn. Basically, the hockey equivalent of the mailroom is you do everything, right? You start in the office and you learn about the salary cap and you learn how contracts are managed, and you get inside the door of those boardrooms, and the first 12 months are a complete eye opener. It's like, I didn't know this, I didn't know that, I didn't know this, I didn't know that. But what happens is you put in the time the way Craig Conroy did. You get out on the road and scout, and you then check all the boxes or climb all the rungs in the ladder, whatever you want to do. And then suddenly you are prepared to take that on, and your resume is out there. And other than, Buffalo kicking tires that one time, no one gave him a look. And I think that probably at a certain point, he was wondering if he would ever get a look. And he did even say at the press conference that he thought he might be a GM by now, but he never thought it would be Calgary. So this is a really good outcome. In fact, I think all three of the moves that are kind of interconnected, Craig Conroy here, Brad Treliving to Toronto, Kyle Dubas to Pittsburgh, it gives everybody a fresh start. A fresh opportunity to stamp their own mark on the team. I mean, I thought it was instructive that, as open as Craig Conroy was at the press conference, it was very clear from the beginning that he had his own ideas about how to steer this thing forward. And I think that they really corresponded with what the fan base in this market was hoping for a long time too, which is that these players that have been apprenticing, for the Wranglers need to be given an opportunity to play in the National Hockey League. And that's just a way of doing business in today's NHL. Like I'm thinking, there's Toronto putting Matthew Knies in the lineup at the last minute and him making a contribution, Seattle going to Ty Karche and making a contribution, and Calgary refusing to do that when they really needed that push from young players, the energy that they provide, the skill level that they provide. I mean, if the Flames win a few more games in overtime and in the shootout, they're in the playoffs, and then who knows what might have happened. And the players that might have contributed to that were watching rather than playing. So, simply telling people in the organization, publicly and privately, that we are not going to go out and sign 30-year-olds to one-way NHL contracts, but we are going to keep some roster spots open. And you come to training camp and there's an opportunity to win a spot, but you better be ready to win it, because we are not going to hand you a jersey. And so I think that provides extra motivation for all of the young players that have been waiting for an opportunity. And let's face it, Rob, these guys can all add, or if they can't, their agents can. And when you've got 13 one-way contracts on the roster, that your opportunity of making it out of training camp is very slim. So have it simply that part of the vision and stating it so publicly and so emphatically right at the beginning, I think, sends a positive message throughout the organization. The other thing is, being at that press conference, you just felt, walking into the Dome a lot of times over the past 12 months, and I didn't do that much, but I was there enough. And there was just sort of a cloud that kind of hung over there. It was not a fun or happy workplace. And a professional ice hockey team is no different than working for a website like The Athletic, like I do, or any job that anybody out there has. Ultimately you are reporting to someone, and your job is a lot easier if the atmosphere that you're working in is positive and collegial and interactive, and people are listening to people up and down the chain. It just makes it happier to jump out of bed in the morning and think, yeah, I want to go out and do my job. And I didn't have that sense around Calgary the last 12 months or so. And then you walk in again, and there's, Craig Conroy sitting there, and his personality is infectious, and it lifts people. And that matters. I mean, it matters. It's a workplace. It is a workplace. And so I think that workplace is going to be a happier place. And as a result of that, a more productive place.
The one thing that I've said, because I was out all of last week and I've come back and I've said it a couple of times, just watching the coverage and the way that Craig Conroy, was portrayed. I'm a little concerned that people think he's happy-go-lucky. There's some bite to that dog, right?
No doubt about it. Yeah, and I wrote that in one of my pieces too. That there's a competitor there, and you don't go from being the 6th round draft choice of the Montreal Canadiens and having to fight and claw your way to the NHL, and then having the kind of NHL career that Craig Conroy had, over 1,000 games, close to the Stanley Cup final, #1 center, Selke candidate, a number of different years. If you don't have some backbone, if you don't have some bite, if you don't have a competitive edge, you're not going to survive. And I think, it was best illustrated in all of the stories that have come out over the years about his friendship with Jerome McGinley. I mean, they would be competing over video games in Banff at team retreats. I mean, they both had that in them. They're competitive, and those things. Like I always think that like we all have a competitive streak. For some people it's completely off the charts, and for some people it has to be pushed out. But if you don't have it, I just don't think that you can have success at professional hockey. It has to be from visceral and from within the person. And I think that Craig Conroy's history as a player and then as a manager is that he's got that. I mean, what did he say? He wants to win the Stanley Cup. That is the thing that a box that he wants to check on his resume. And he came really close once as a player. And the only way to do it right now is as a manager. He talked about possibly, going to coach Clarkson when his playing career was over, and you can't win a Stanley Cup coaching Clarkson. You're only going to be able to do it in an NHL front office position. So I think that that is something else. Again, if you're a fan of the hockey team, you want to hear that. What do people want here? They want a championship. It's been a long time, and they want it again. And they know that in a 32-team NHL, again, everybody can do the math. It's harder than ever to do it. Everybody's competitive. Everybody has smart people. There's a salary cap that limits what you can and can't spend. So it's hard. But I think that there are pieces in place here that suggest that you have a chance to certainly be a playoff team. And if this year's Stanley Cup Finals, and really the Stanley Cup Finals of the last 6 years, will tell you anything, that old truth about just get in and you never know, that is true, because this is the third 16th seed in 6 years that is in the Stanley Cup final. Now, having said that, the last 2 didn't win, but they got to the Stanley Cup final. They punched a ticket. They gave themselves a chance. So, if you look at, objectively at Florida on paper, 92 points, Calgary on paper, 93, and then think about, how many players in Calgary underachieved. I mean, that's a good hockey team. So I don't think you have to tear it apart. I think you need to get everybody going in the same direction and not at cross purposes, which seemed to be a lot of what happened this year, and then see where you're at. But the other thing where, his, managerial style differed, and he wasn't afraid to say it, is that we just cannot afford to lose assets and get nothing in return. He specifically cited Johnny Gaudreau and what the implications were there. And I think you and I both know that they really thought that Gaudreau was going to sign. And right up until that last minute, I think they felt that they were going to get a yes, and then it ended up being a no at the 11th hour. And it was almost as if, he had thought, he was going in one direction and then somehow, changed at the last minute. So hard to gauge against that, but you can, if you're proactive and you get out in front of it. And so that's why this summer will be interesting. I do think that, that there is a Sorry about that.
No, it's all good.
Yeah, there is an implication sometimes that you can wait on players that are going into those final years of their contract until the trade deadline and possibly get something for them. And that I suppose is an option for Calgary. But I think that once they have a coach in place, they'll have a better idea of who might be retained and who might be moving on. But I think that we're going to see some decisiveness, and the decisiveness will be earlier than it has been in the past.
Is there any danger of staying internal for the coaching candidate too? If you stay internal with the general manager, is it too much of the?
Well, you know what, Rob? That's a good question. So again, if you're asking me to put on my general manager's hat, I'd like to see Ryan Husker get a shot at the job. To me, again, if it's me, I'm hiring him. I look at again his resume. He has coached at the American Hockey League level. He's been a successful coach as an assistant and associate at the National Hockey League level. It just feels like he is ready. You talk to him; he's a smart guy. I think that he has the ability to command the room. I mean, part of coaching, you have to do so many things, right? You have to be able to manage people. You have to be able to create a strategy. You have to be able to at least hire the right assistants to put in place special teams and systems play. I think he can do that. I think he can do that. I think the risk of promoting someone like Mitch Love, who I think, I don't know him really at all, but I would suggest that he is probably in the same position that Spencer Carberry was in when Spencer Carberry was a rising star in the Washington organization, went to Toronto as an assistant, because learning the National Hockey League, that has value. I used to travel with a team for decades, and the first time around the National Hockey League, when you're learning, when you're going to airports you haven't been to, when you're going to hotels you haven't been to, when you're going and finding the arena entrances that you haven't been to, when you go to the visitors' locker room that you haven't, it's a learning experience, and you just drink it in so much that first one or two times around the league, and then after that you kind of know your way, and there's a comfort level. And so I think that there's value in that. So Spencer Carberry's path was a successful coach in the American Hockey League. I believe he was the AHL coach of the year the year before Mitch Love won the two. Goes to Toronto, associate coach, hired in Washington, and now will get his opportunity. So that seems like the next path forward for Mitch Love. Either become an assistant on the staff here or somewhere else, and I'm sure that a door will open for him very soon down the road in the NHL. But there is value to coaching at the NHL level. And in terms of Kirk Muller, it's funny, you like to move the pieces around. I think Kirk Muller would be the perfect coach in Anaheim. Like I think they've interviewed 5,000 people there by the sounds of it. Virtually everybody that has a coaching resume has been spoken to on some level by Pat Verbeek. But I look at the situation in Anaheim. They've already gone and hired a new coach for San Diego, and he's coming from the German league. And he has a great resume, and a lot of people believe he is going to be the coach in waiting. So what you need in Anaheim right now is somebody to come in and be a positive influence, knowing that organization is it's very much a beginning of a rebuilding stage. So you need positivity, because you're going to be losing a lot. So I think of Kirk Muller's personality, his going back to when he was coaching Queens, his ability to work with young players. He seems like the perfect fit. He has a connection with Pat Verbeek that going back to their playing days that I think matters. And so I'd like to see him get a chance to take over the team in Anaheim. I think he'd be a really good fit, and it would get a chance to get his NHL career back on track. And then if at some later point down the road, they feel that they need to go in a different direction, they could.
Cautionary tale, though, from Peter Marr brought it up on Wednesday, so I'll bounce it off because he's one of my favorites, and that was Jimmy Playfair. Jimmy was assistant, then made the head coach. For Ryan Husker, what pitfalls or traps do you have to avoid if you're escalated like that?
Well, I think that the role of the assistant coach is different than the head coach, and a lot of times he's the buffer between the players and the head coach. I think that was an important role this past year. And so when you become the head coach, you're no longer the player's friend. You are the head coach, and your voice might be a little more strident than it was as an assistant coach. But I I think Jim Playfair did a really good job, and I wish they'd stayed with him longer. I think again, to judge someone as quickly as as it sometimes happens in the National Hockey League can be a mistake. I'll go, and cite the case of someone else that really well, Jared Bednar, right?
Yep.
So Jared Bednar gets hired out of the American Hockey League after a very successful run in Cleveland there, goes to Colorado, has one of the worst seasons in the post salary cap era, 48-point team. And it looks to all of the people from the outside as if he's a guy that is going to be, sacrificed for that poor season. And God bless Joe Sakic for sticking with him, for seeing the things that he saw in Jared Bednar when he hired him 12 months later were still there. And he gave him another chance. And he just signed a contract extension to make himself one of the highest paid coaches in the National Hockey League. But his career, NHL coaching career, was teetering in the balance there. And he had a manager that showed faith in him, and that faith proved to be the right move. And if we could go back in time and have seen if Jim Playfair had a little bit a longer leash, could he have evolved into a successful NHL coach? I firmly believe he could have. In fact, I see a lot of, like when I think about Jim's personality, I see a lot of that in Ryan Huska.
Yeah.
Jim went on to, be an assistant coach in Arizona, and I was down there a lot for a period of time. His kid, Dylan, his son, was just getting into acting. I remember the first time he told me about it, and this television show that he was in that I'd never heard of because I don't watch that. And then, he's turned out to have, Dylan Playfair has had this tremendous acting career. But I just think that someone needed to show a little bit more patience with Jim Playfair, and he would have been fine.
I think it was hard in that Daryl Sutter shadow too, right? And having him as your general manager.
Yeah.
Speaking of GMs, 18th general manager in Toronto Maple Leafs history, but second general manager to come from Calgary. Brad Treliving yesterday.
I know. I wrote a column about that because I was around when the first one moved. But I do think there's a lot of parallels. So we're talking about Cliff Fletcher, of course. So Cliff won the Stanley Cup here with Calgary in 1979. He was the general manager that overseed the move of the team from Atlanta to Calgary. And in 1991, I know he was looking for a new challenge. His kids had been launched. His wife, Boots, wanted to be in Florida a lot. He was just here alone by himself a lot and was looking for something new. So, resigned from the Flames, and, in over, a period of months, an opening came up in Toronto. He replaced Floyd Smith as the general manager. He made the trade that ruined the Flames a few months later by, plucking Doug Gilmour and Jamie McCowan and Rick Walmsley out of Calgary. And I won't even bother going through the Gary Lehman, Alexander. Anyway, but he did, in a very short period of time, make the Leafs relevant again. And that was a team that came very, very close, 1993, 1994, in those playoffs to at least get into the Stanley Cup final. A lot of people, will remember very well that, seventh game of Toronto, Los Angeles in 93. I know the hope of people writing was that would be a Toronto-Montreal final, which would have been great. Didn't happen. And then Montreal ended up winning the Stanley Cup in Patrick Roy's, year where he had 10 overtime wins. But I think one of the things that I think you can learn from that Cliff Fletcher experience or experiment was that you can hire the right guy. Like Cliff Fletcher was the right guy at that time. The Leafs were a laughing stock, post Harold Ballard, and he restored credibility to that franchise. Still didn't win, and they're still waiting to win. And I think that's part of the problem that that everybody wants to have a Stanley Cup parade. Players want to have Stanley Cup rings. They want their names engraved on the Stanley Cup. But I mean, the reality is he was the right man for the job. Did a great job. Still didn't win. Eventually, they tried someone else, and I honestly believe they went backwards after they went away from Cliff Fletcher. And then he was back again in 2008 to try and salvage the franchise again. Had a lot of salary cap work to clean up. Did a really good job there, and then handed the reins over to Brian Burke, I think was next in line after Cliff the second time. So that's a long preamble to the fact that, here now is Brad Treliving going into a good team in Toronto. That is one of the big differences. Cliff inherited a terrible team. Brad Treliving has lots of good pieces there, but he needs to be that general manager that takes them to the next level. I often think about, Pittsburgh when they won those, when they had that good initial run in 2007, 2008, and Ray Shero was the general manager. It was really Craig Patrick that put that team together, right? Yeah. When you think about Colorado winning in 1995, the first year in Denver, it was really Pierre Pagé that put that team together. So what Pierre Lacroix did for that team was he got Patrick Waugh in trade, but the pieces, the Sakic's, the Forsbergs, they were all there from the previous regime. When Brian Burke took over Anaheim, the pieces were put in place by Brian Murray and Al Coates. So there's a long history in the National Hockey League of a general manager coming in at the 11th hour almost in a building process, and the test for them is going to be to take these very good pieces and then figure out how to get them over the top. And so that implies a lot of pressure because Toronto is at this stage of the game Stanley Cup or bust. They're capped out. They have important contract decisions coming with 4 key players. The player that would be the one that you would, if there was no trades, if you could just wave a magic wand and make things happen in the league, if you could take the John Tavares contract out of the mix, now you suddenly have lots of flexibility to re-sign the other 3 big names, Matthews, Marner, and Nylander, solve your problem in goal, and otherwise the pieces look pretty good. I do think that, you can find the right supporting cast to play in Toronto. Kyle Dubas proved that. There's an awful lot of people that will go to Toronto and play for small money by NHL standards in order to be on a Leaf team that potentially could win. So it's an interesting challenge. And honestly, I don't know how you solve it other than you roll back 85% of the team that had 111 points, sort out the goaltending, and know that in 1 year's time, there'll only be a year left on Tavares's contract, and in 2 years' time, the contract will be gone. And the other thing that doesn't get talked about a lot in the National Hockey League is, although the salary cap for next year is only going up by probably $1 million or $2 million, it will jump significantly in 2 years' time. So any general manager operating right now better have a 1-year plan and a 2-year plan, because the 1-year plan allows you to be competitive, hopefully, in a year where money is going to be tight, and knowing full well that the decisions that you make, or the contracts that you can defer, or the raises that you can defer to 2 years down the road, there will be additional room in the system to pay those contracts. And so I think that will be the case in Toronto. Everyone will want them to win next year, but there's going to be more flexibility and options in year 2 than there will be right out of the gate for Brad Treliving.
Should I worry about Brad? He's a friend of mine. I like Brad. He's a nice guy. Does he have the right armor to be in Toronto?
Well, that's a good question. So I think that, I hope somebody talks to him about that and warns him about it, because, and I've related this story to you before, but I do remember having that conversation with Ron Wilson when he went in as a coach, and Ron was, considered himself media friendly, and, he was gregarious and well-spoken, and it was like, I got it, Eric. I remember, I'm paraphrasing, but it's like, you don't have to tell me how to, handle myself in the media. And I said, but it's the relentlessness of it. I said, that's the thing that will drive you crazy, the relentlessness of it. There's just so many people there, and everybody wants a piece, and everybody wants to be your friend, and it will just overwhelm you, because, like, you never get a break from it. Now, it's different being a coach, because you're out in front of the microphone every day, and a manager, and in Toronto, the managers don't speak very often. But I do think that there is a tremendous amount of pressure. I think there's a lot of very friendly media in Toronto. I think there's, a percentage of people, especially, a number of the ex-players there, that just want the team to succeed. And they actually have no problem just saying it. I'm a fan, and I want the team to succeed. Yep. The problem is, if you're working in the media and you are responding like a fan, and you want the teams to succeed, a lot of times you react the way fans do when the team doesn't. And so, I think that what Brad Treliving needs to do is learn to filter all of that stuff out. And while there was always noise in Calgary, because it is a Canadian media market, it was just a fraction of what he's going to face in Toronto. But I think he goes into it with his eyes wide open, and I think that he does have the kind of winning personality that makes a good first impression. Like I have 4 colleagues at the Athletic in Toronto that cover the Leafs essentially and don't do anything else. And overall, the impression that he made in that first press conference was very positive.
I just, boy, oh boy, if you win there, man.
Oh yeah,
right?
you
If
get a
you-
statue. Cliff basically told me that when he went there. He said the person that can deliver a chance. And this was 1991 when the drought had only been
Yeah.
24 years or whatever
Yeah.
it was. If you can win there, they'll build a statue outside of Maple Leaf Gardens. So that was 91, and another 32 years have passed, and they're still waiting. So yes, you're right. The person who wins in Toronto will be, well, it'll be like the Rangers being remembered in 1994 for breaking a 54-year drought. They're still, Mark
Absolutely.
Messier can walk on water there. He can do no wrong because he was part of that team that helped them end that Stanley Cup drought. So yeah, if it happens, but Rob, it could. I honestly thought this was like, so the final starts tomorrow. At the start of the playoffs, if you had asked me, I would have said Edmonton, Toronto.
Yep.
That's who I thought. Edmonton, Toronto. That seemed the way Edmonton was playing down the stretch. I thought Toronto had a real good chance against Tampa. I know a lot of people didn't like the goaltending matchup there, and especially after Florida took out Boston, that felt like, okay, that's the one stumbling block. They could never get by Boston. There was a psychological thing about Boston. Florida took Boston out of the mix there, and then they couldn't beat Florida. So, they should be playing in the Stanley Cup final. And I'm sure internally that's what they're saying today. We should be there, not Florida. So let's be careful not to overreact because we couldn't get past them. They were on a roll. Things happened. Sergei Bobrovsky decided to be the second coming of Georges Vezina or Ken Dryden or whatever.
Right.
And that's a factor, for every team. And, if you run into a goalie that just plays like a brick wall, sometimes it's just hard to get enough offense. But I think they're close, and I don't think they have to do too much to get over the top. Maybe just need to be a little bit luckier.
Is one of the new rivalries in the National Hockey League Brendan Shanahan and Kyle Dubas in Pittsburgh?
Well, I don't know. That's hard to say. That would only be a result of a couple of public back and forths. Since they went through that entire soap opera there, and now suddenly Kyle Dubas lands in Pittsburgh. It would be more of a rivalry if they were in the same division and they faced each other all the time, and they were fighting for a place in the standings. I think one of the things that Kyle Dubas said, and maybe he said it just to distance himself from the time in Toronto, is what do we want to do? We want to win the division. That's the most important thing. We're in the Metropolitan Division. We want to win the Metropolitan Division with the team that we have and the team that we will ice in October, and then we'll see what happens. I mean, would a Pittsburgh Toronto conference final in May of 2024 be fun? Yeah, and then I think that you could maybe make that point that is conflicting visions, whether if you want to call it that, or a power struggle that one wanted to retain the power, one wanted to get more power. I mean, that remains to be seen. So I think that's one, honestly, that will fade to the background. The Leafs are going to worry about their house. Pittsburgh has decisions to make, especially in goal. And I mean, that to me is a fascinating situation, because one of the things I did today was crunch the numbers. And everyone is trying to compare Pittsburgh's group of 3, which is Crosby, Malkin, and Letang, to that group of 4 in Toronto. And the suggestion is that there's the similarity is there in terms of the impact of those players, but obviously the Toronto group is much younger. But the reality is different. I mean, those 3 Pittsburgh players together chew up about $20 million in the salary cap, right? So Malkin's at 6'1", Letang is at 6'1", and Crosby is in his 17th year of earning a cap hit of $8.7 million. By the way, did you know Sidney Crosby's salary this year was $3 million? And that was going to be $3 million next year and $3 million the year after. Actual cash. Money in Sidney Crosby's pocket. Made $3 million this year, and he'll make $3 million next year and $3 million in the final year of the contract. It was a front-loaded contract. It's a 12-year contract. I think it was 12 million or something in the first year. But Sidney Crosby this past year and the next 2 years will have $3 million in actual cash. So where does that put him? Around 400th in the NHL in
Yes.
actual compensation. I
Yeah.
mean, there's a lot of fringe players on a lot of teams that are going to make more actual dollars than Sidney Crosby. So I think you know what his motivation are. But my point is simply this, that it's 20 million allocated to 3 aging superstars, no question aging, but still contributing superstars,
Yep.
as opposed to, Marner and Tavares together are 22 million. So more than those 3 combined. So there's more flexibility in Pittsburgh than you think. And I think the biggest problem is that Tristan Jarry is just coming off the books at 3.5, and you need a goaltending solution there. Now, I believe, and I've said this for a while, that John Gibson is going to shake loose in Anaheim. I think I had him. Well, we had him on our offseason trade board in the top 10. I had him 2 when I put it together, but our list is a merged list of 3 or 4 of us national writers. But I went back and looked at what I wrote 3 weeks ago when we were doing that, and I said that I believe Gibson is going to be traded this year, and I believe there's 3 possible destinations. One is Pittsburgh, which is his hometown. One is Los Angeles, which is a team that desperately needs a goaltending, but that would be provocative to be traded to a divisional rival. And the other would be Vegas, which again, is swinging for the fences on everyone. But it's possible that just because of the way Aiden Hill has played, the fact that they still have Robin Lehner on the books, that would be more difficult to manage. But if there's a way of getting, John Gibson at 6.4 for 4 more years onto that team to stabilize the goaltending, probably have to move Granlund out. Maybe you'd look at moving Raquel out. There are some players in that $5 million range that probably shouldn't be there, but that's that is salvageable. And Gibson, to me, because I saw a lot of Anaheim this past year, I think is still an elite level goaltender, even though his numbers don't imply that. There were nights when he would make the first save and the second save and the third save and the fourth one would go in, and after a while the body language, he just looked discouraged some nights. But on the nights when it was a national game, or when there was an opponent, or when he had something to prove, boy, that he looked like John Gibson, top 5 goalie in the National Hockey League. So if I'm Kyle Dubas, again, I'm taking over. I'm making it a priority to get hometown kid John Gibson in as my goaltender, because I need somebody to see out the last of the Crosby, Malkin, Letang era. And he's the guy I think that could make them really competitive again.
Talk about the Stanley Cup final in a second. I just want to ask you about Patrick Kane. Undergoes surgery yesterday, 4 to 6 weeks, or 4 to 6 months, sorry. Yeah. So now we're looking maybe on the outside November, December, but still wants to play. When does he find a home? When he's healthy, or does somebody take a waiver on his recovery?
That's a good question. I think Carolina is a team. So when you look at Carolina, and and especially Don Waddell had his media availability this week, and if you read between the lines of what he said, I mean, he almost came right out and said that he's going to go bargain hunting again. So think about his moves last summer, right? So 2 key guys, one, Max Pacioretty. So he took on the full value of Pacioretty's contract, but basically got the player for free. So he got an elite level player because Vegas needed $7 million off the books, and he was willing to do that because it was only a 1-year contract. Okay, so he gets hurt in training in the summer, and they rehab, and he gets back and plays 5 games. So bad luck for Max, bad luck for the Hurricanes. And then for Brent Burns, he got San, because there was term left on the contract, he got San Jose to take back 33%. And so Burns checked in at 5.2 and change, and he really gave them 5.2 and change worth of play, especially as a replacement to Tony DeAngelo. So that's the modus operandi in Carolina, and I think that they're just sticking with their playbook. So they're going to look around and say, okay, where are the strategic buys? And I think, getting back to your question about Patrick Kane, I think he could be a strategic buy. That's a good enough team to muddle along without Patrick Kane for the first 2-3 months of the year. Ultimately, Carolina will be judged by what they do in the playoffs in 2024. So if you're convinced, and certainly, if you listen to Patrick Kane in his exit interviews in New York, he wants to keep playing. He thinks he can be still really effective. He had a pretty good year considering he could, he was so hampered and limited by the injury. So the comparison to me is what happened with Teemu Selanne when he took, a year and change off of the game to get his knee done. Kane is hip, Selanne was knee, but he was just so limited by his physical ailments that he couldn't play at the level that he was at. And Kane suggested that if he can just get healthy again, and that he can still be an elite player, and I think he can. I don't think that his skill set has been lost at all, and his whole game is creating space and finding open ice. 35 years old, he was never from goal line to goal line, he was never the fastest play, or he made room for himself on the ice because of his craftiness and his hockey sense. So I mean, I'm looking for a home for Patrick Kane. I think people suggest that, might go back to New York. Yeah, he might, that would be good. But I think Carolina would be the perfect place for him. And I think they could probably get him on a reasonable contract. Maybe you sign him for 1 year and then, learn, what he's got left. Let him come to your community and your team and see what he can contribute and so on and so forth. But I think it's good. I just like watching Patrick Kane play hockey. When you think about, all of those small, shifty guys, the Kanes, the Alex DeBrincats, players like that. What's going to happen with DeBrincat? He's due a $9 million qualifying offer in Ottawa. And again, you're kind of reading the body language a little bit. Does that feel a little bit like the Tkachuk and the Gaudreau situation in Calgary, that he's just not loving being in a small market Canadian city and doesn't really want to commit long term there. And I mean, if you're Carolina, which by the way has 24 million in cap space, so they can do this, why not go out and get DeBrincat and Kane? Get them both.
Yeah.
I mean, two small players. Do you want two small guys? Well, if they're skilled enough, maybe you do. And then all of a sudden, now you've got maybe enough goal scoring to take you over the top, because that was clearly the thing that they were lacking when they lost in the last round to Florida.
So, Florida and Vegas in a Stanley Cup final. I've already run at the television overlords for making us wait, and we've lost some people, but it will finally start tomorrow. What do you make of this? Where do you give an edge?
Well, it's hard to find an edge unless you focus strictly on the goaltending. So I do an exercise at The Athletic where I talk to a longtime executive scout and coach through every round, and they're all really good. I mean, the beauty of them is because we grant them anonymity, they give you the perspective that each of them brings. The coach brings a coaching perspective, the executive brings a team building perspective, the scout brings here's what I what I'm seeing in the guy's perspective. And so when I called this week and asked them all about the series, almost the first words out of their mouths were Bobrovsky, right? So they were seeing from Bobrovsky what we have occasionally seen in the playoffs, where a goalie just goes on a heater and never stops. J.S. Jaguar for Anaheim, Ken Dryden way back, Patrick Waugh in 93, as we talked about before. One of them brought up Steve Penny. I brought up Jordan Binnington. I mean, we've seen this, we're a goaltender that, like in some of these cases, we're talking about Hall of Famers, but, J.S. Jaguar, he willed that Anaheim team to the Stanley Cup final against and basically almost won it for them until they lost to Jersey in Game 7. Still ended up winning the MVP. So that's Bobrovsky in these playoffs, and he didn't even start the playoffs. They were going with Alex Lyon. So how did you see that coming? No one could see it coming. Florida couldn't even see that coming. But he is a two-time Vezina Trophy winner, and there was a reason they gave him 8 years at $10 million a year, because at his best, right now he's the best goalie in the National Hockey League. But he's the best goalie in the National Hockey League. And so, and then you look at Adin Hill. So the comparable to Adin Hill, I think, is last year's Darcy Kemper, right? So what were we talking about a year ago going into the Colorado-Tampa final, right? The one thing that you liked about Tampa versus Colorado, Vasilevsky against Kemper, one with this bulletproof pedigree, previous championships. Darcy Kemper, up and down, but not in the same league. And I remember doing your friend, Bob McCown and John Shannon's podcast, and I'm saying good goaltending might be good enough, and I got shouted down by all three of them. And when I reminded John Shannon about that after the fact, he said, Bob will have forgotten about it already. And great, But so that is my way of saying we can look at the matchup on paper and say Bobrovsky versus Adin Hill, it unquestionably favors Florida. But if Adin Hill can do what Kemper did, and then if Vegas can lean on Florida and that, because they're big and strong, and I love their fourth line. Normally when we talk about teams that get this far in the playoffs, you focus on the third
Yeah,
line, right?
yeah,
You know, that,
yeah.
you know, it's that,
That's
you know,
right.
Sammy Paulson guy or the Keith
Oh,
Primo type,
Sammy
somebody
Paulson.
like that. Like
Paulson,
that.
Mona Niedermeyer,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So those lines sometimes, like if teams are even, it's getting like an unexpected lift out of a third line that makes the difference. So I'm watching that deciding game with Vegas, and I practically jumped out of my chair. Do you know the goal I'm going to describe? It's the Keegan Colasar goal, right? So Colasar takes the puck, makes a bank pass off the boards. You know, Carrier swoops in, grabs it. Colasar goes to the net, takes the return pass, scores. It was a beautiful goal. It's the highlight of the night, as far as I'm concerned. The highlight of the night was performed by the fourth line. And I said that to all of my, you know, my panel. I said, when did the fourth line make plays like that? That was the most skillful play in the game, and it was done by the fourth line. So I'm looking at the fourth line factor in with Vegas, and that to me is, you know, like, you know, on the Florida side, you know, you make the case for Bobrovsky and Matthew Tkachuk, and then after that, you know, the pieces fall into place. But those are the two key X factors. But to me, that Vegas fourth line is the new third line, and they're big and strong and tough. And as my coach said, they never hand off a bad shift. You put them out there, they never hand off a bad shift. Even if they don't score, they don't hand off a bad shift. So I think that's an important contributor on the Vegas side. And the other thing is just the way William Karlsson is playing. Like we had a poll internally asking for, you know, MVP after 3 rounds. And because I think Vegas is going to win, I picked Karlsson as my Conn Smythe. I'll probably be the only one that does that. And for sure, if it ends up being Florida, you know, Tkachuk or Bobrovsky, the voters are going to have a hard time choosing between the two of them. But if you look at Vegas, who do you take? You know, do you take a goaltender? Well, they started with Brossoit. You probably can't. You know, Eichel had a tremendous second round.
That's who I would have gone with.
But, you know, his third round was just okay, right? His third round was just okay. Karlsson has 10 goals, and he checked the heck out of McDavid. So he's giving it to you offensively, and he's also, you know, checking the key guy on the other team. So, you know, to me, William Karlsson and the fourth line are the factors in Vegas. And I picked Vegas in 7.
And I have no reason to, that's both guests have picked Vegas. The only thing that I think when I think of Florida outside of Bobrovsky, are we watching Matthew Tkachuk turn into a superstar? Are we seeing that supernova, not coming out party, because he scored 100 plus points last year, but he went in and ran Boston's show at the end of that, right? He has, you know, what he did against Carolina when it mattered. I just wonder if we're watching something in front of our own eyes.
Yeah, and I don't have a good answer for that, because I don't know. Like, I was asked on a radio show or podcast recently about, you know, the Tkachuk's breakout year, and I said, no, the breakout year was 2 years ago. I said, you know, like, if you were paying attention, he was the 8th leading scorer in the league 2 years ago, and he was 1/3 of the top line in hockey with Johnny Gaudreau and Elias Lindholm. So to imply that this started from the moment he arrived in Florida is incorrect. I think the maturing of Matthew Tkachuk started 2 years ago. So, you know, I made the point, I think, that, you know, when he was a young player coming in, there was a real level of immaturity there, a level of immaturity you see with, you know, players like Trevor Zegras right now in Anaheim, and that often happens, and you can either continue to be immature throughout your entire career, or you can learn from the experiences that you have along the way. And I think that's what happened with Matthew Tkachuk. I think he became a better teammate. I think his teammates didn't have to fight his battles as often as time went on, and I think he became an important part of the leadership group, which I don't think he was in the beginning. So what you're seeing is a gradual process with Matthew Tkachuk, and, you know, as you suggested, that's now 2 years as a top 10 scorer in the National Hockey League. So I would suggest he's already there. The one thing that people always use, a term that people always used to describe him, was he was a unicorn. And I'm not sure that I really bought that, but then when you look at the way he has managed to raise his level at the precise time when you want someone to raise his level, and he's done it so consistently in these playoffs that, you know, like now I'm starting to come on board with the fact that, yeah, he probably is a unicorn, and he is, you know, unlike anyone else in the game. So Connor McDavid is still the best player. You know, I think Leon Draisaitl is the second best player, and then I love Nathan McKinnon and Cale Makar. So those, you know, like if you do that exercise, you know, who do you start your franchise with? You know, I'm taking those 4 ahead of Matthew Tkachuk. But then after that, it gets interesting, right? You know, Austin Matthews, great goal scorer, but you know, the things that Tkachuk brings to the mix, you know, he checks a lot of boxes. I don't know, but yeah, he's, you know, he's had an incredible run. I also think that if it comes up short and Vegas ends up winning, over time, and in the world we live in right now, it will happen very quickly. Teams almost always forget about those, you know, those great runner-up finishes. And I'll go back to a point that I raised at the start of our conversation. You know, Nashville, well, that was an unbelievable run in 2017, you know, as the 16th seed. But when they didn't get it done, you know, they kind of went backwards, right? And then Montreal, 2020, 16th seed, got to the final. Everyone's very excited about the future, and they go backwards.
So why does 2004 still resonate here?
Well, because it hasn't happened since then, you know. And plus, I think a lot of
people. But does 2017 resonate in Nashville the same way?
Oh, it probably does in that community, but in the grand scheme of things, you know. Like,
yes,
you know,
yeah.
You walk in the Hockey Hall of Fame. There's the Stanley Cup, 2023. If it says Vegas there and not Florida, then, you know, it'll be like, was that the year that Florida was in the final?
Agreed. Absolutely agree.
Even people that pay real close attention to this, I mean, I have to look it up all the time to make sure I don't get my 2018 finalists confused with my 2019 finalists.
Who did Anaheim beat?
Yeah,
right. A lot of people probably don't remember.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. Anyway, so I think that he's taken 3 of the 4 necessary steps to solidify himself in the at the level that you suggest. But I also think that if they don't take this 4th step, that you know, it'll be back to square one in September's training camp, and then the season will start, and they'll have a good team. But Tampa will have a good team, and Boston will have a good team, and Toronto will have a good team, and Ottawa's getting better, and Buffalo's getting better. I mean, if you look at
Detroit,
Detroit, you know, not quite at that level yet, but still there. I mean, that's the best division in hockey already, and it's just going to get better because a couple of those young teams, I think, are ready to take the next step. So, you know, they barely made the playoffs this year. I mean, I think about when Carolina won the Cup, you know, in 2006. Yeah. And then the next year, where were they? Right?
Who was the starting goalie for Carolina in 2006 in the start of the playoffs? Right?
At the start was Martin Gerber, and Cam Ward won it for them. You know, so they're, you know, that was when.
Well, that's how unexpected it was.
Exactly.
Because that's a rookie too.
Sure. Exactly.
I love it.
So anyway.
No. This is not a question. I'm not even sure. I'm just going to say it, and then you can react. How crazy is it when you and I started doing this? I felt like you and I were the only 2 adults in the room talking about Gary's Southern teams and Nashville and Florida, and now he's forcing it in Vegas and Florida.
Yeah.
And it doesn't even feel odd to me 20 years later.
Yeah.
Does it?
No, exactly. Yeah. And I think that, you know, so you're talking about the vision of the National Hockey League and the footprint
Sun
of Gary
Belt
Bettman
and all of that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that was done, I think, largely for television purposes.
Sure
I think that, you know, when Gary Bettman took over 30 years ago now, I guess, you know, his broader vision for the National Hockey League was to get national television contracts back when those meant something, when television wasn't as split and diversified as it is today. And he felt that the only way to do that was to grow the hockey audience in non-traditional markets. And he's done that. Now, having said that, you know, the Florida building is full now, but you know, that's not a great location. Anyone that's ever been out to Sunrise, you know,
nice mall.
It wasn't a great location, and you know, let's check back on you know, the Tuesday in the middle of November to see, you know, how many people are in the seats. That happens in Carolina. Nashville, for whatever reason, has just got it. You
awesome.
know, Tampa as well. So there's nothing wrong with the vision, but I also think that it reflects a little bit about, how the modern day player feels about the National Hockey League. There was a time when the lure of playing for the Toronto Maple Leafs, the Montreal Canadiens, the Boston Bruins, the Chicago Blackhawks, the original 6 teams, that mattered something. I don't know that it matters as much anymore. Like, a young player will pay lip service to the fact that he was drafted by an original 6 team, but it doesn't feel like they're saying it with any conviction. During their lifetimes, the National Hockey League has been somewhere between a 24 and a 32 team entity. And so, when I started, it was 6 teams. Those 6 teams matter to me. Now, if you play for one of those 6 teams, you're going to face extra scrutiny from the media. There's going to be more pressure from the fans. And if you have a chance to play in Florida or in Vegas, you go about your business, you're popular. And then when you go home, you have your privacy and your life. And I think that more and more players coming into the league value that, and it makes it increasingly difficult to play in the markets, like that we're reporting from today, and and that we were talking about earlier in the show, Toronto. And so, Matthew Tkachuk never articulated exactly why he wanted out of Calgary and why he wanted to go to Florida, other than, I guess, he gave an interview saying that Sam Bennett showed him around and was like, hey, this looks like a pretty good place. But part of the attraction is, it's Florida, right? Keith can go down there in the winter and, and have his flip-flops on and play a round of golf. And it's just, it's a healthier life. I think about Phoenix, all those years when Dave Tippett was running the team and Dave King was there and Brad Treliving was an assistant general manager. Don Maloney was the GM. They had something to sell there. You go to the rink, and you leave and you're wearing your flip-flops. Bill Armstrong, I talked to Bill Armstrong he's the current general manager in Coyotes. I talked to him several times this year. And, one of the things that he said was that, not everybody necessarily would want to play in this market, but we have a lot to offer. He talked about taxes. He talked about climate. He talked about, the potential at that time, of course, of a new arena, which seems to be, on hold at the moment. But it's a pretty compelling case. I almost felt like he was using my column as a sales pitch for players in the National Hockey League, because it was like, come in and look us over and you'll see it's not too bad, and I think that is absolutely true.
Well, what really resonates was the point you made about the original 6, because it used to be something. Like, your team is an original 6. Like, your team's an expansion team. Like, I'm talking about the Flames and the Oilers and all that. And now that just seems like so distant, doesn't it?
It does to me. And again, I grew up in Toronto, and when, back before merchandising was as popular as it is, you had to go down to Doug Laurie's Sporting Goods in the Gardens. It's the only place you could buy a Leaf sweater. I got my Borja Salming sweater there. Still have it in the closet after all these years. And it meant something. It was the Toronto Maple Leafs. And actually, that was something that Brad Treliving said at the press conference. It's the Leafs. It's the Leafs. But he's a lifer. And it matters, to someone that has been around the game for as long as he have. And I'm not sure that it necessarily matters to everybody that's coming into the game today.
Well, it matters to us out west too, for the guys like me that watch Bugs Bunny and then Hockey Night in Canada. One game, right? A single game on Saturday night. That was it. And it was Montreal or it was going to be Toronto. It just, boy, we're old. It's changed a lot, hasn't it?
Let's not try to dwell on that.
No, let's not dwell on that. Let's go to Vegas. Thank you for this, sir. I guess in a couple of weeks, we'll be halfway through this series the way it's straightened out. But it's going to be a busy couple of weeks, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And then the 30th, which I guess is the second next time that I'm here, the draft will be over and free agency will be about to start.
I know.
So guess what? It'll be busy again.
It will be busy again.
It'll be busy still. All right.
Thanks for coming in, buddy.
Yeah, no problem.
There you go. Eric Duhatschek.